If you could be out of pain, or you could have a perfect championship walk, what would you rather have?
The morning of July 24th, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day the immortal image of Hulk Hogan finally met its tragic end. For decades, fans had believed that the man behind the red and yellow was indestructible. He was the hero who body-slammed giants, who lifted entire arenas with the sound of his voice, and who told generations of children to train, say their prayers, and eat their vitamins. But behind that larger-than-life persona, Terry Gene Bollea, the man the world knew as Hulk Hogan, was fighting his final battle. And unlike the countless times he had staged comebacks in the wrestling ring, this time there would be no kick-out, no miraculous rally, no grand return. It began like any other hot summer morning in Clearwater, Florida. The sunlight shimmered on the water outside Hogan's beachfront home, a place that had hosted countless celebrations, family gatherings, and quiet retreats over the years. Yet inside that home, panic was unfolding. At 9:51 a.m., a frantic 911 call was placed. The caller's identity remains undisclosed, but the voice carried urgency, desperation, and the weight of knowing that something irreversible was happening. The message to emergency services was chilling. Hulk Hogan was in cardiac arrest. For paramedics, it was a race against time. Clearwater Fire and Rescue arrived just 5 minutes later, bursting into the home with all their gear and training prepared for what lay ahead. What they found was a surreal image. Hulk Hogan, the man who once seemed like a superhero, was lying motionless. The hands that had gripped championship belts, the body that had endured decades of punishment, now betrayed him. His famous chest rose and fell only with the rhythm of compressions as medical professionals began administering CPR. It was a battle unlike any Hogan had ever faced, and his life, quite literally, depended on every push, every breath, every second of effort from those paramedics. For over 30 minutes, they refused to give up. The dispatch audio later obtained by People magazine showed just how relentless the responders were. Even past the point when most cardiac resuscitations are called off, they continued. They fought with the kind of determination fans had once seen Hogan himself embody. At 10:28 a.m., CPR was still ongoing as Hogan was wheeled toward the waiting ambulance. The surreal image, captured on a bystander's video and later circulated online, showed paramedics pounding on his chest as cameras rolled. The man who had been larger than life now looked vulnerable, fragile, and heartbreakingly human. The ambulance raced through Clearwater's streets, its sirens piercing the morning air. Inside, paramedics continued their desperate battle, clinging to faint signs of hope, brief flickers of heart activity that urged them to keep trying. By 10:32 a.m., Hogan was rushed into Morton Plant Hospital, where a full team of doctors and nurses was waiting. HIPAA regulations and the privacy of the emergency room mean much of what happened behind those doors will never be publicly revealed. But what is clear is that the staff gave everything they could. Nearly an hour and a half after the first 911 call, at 11:17 a.m., the declaration no fan ever wanted to hear became official. Hulk Hogan was gone. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest. Police later confirmed there were no signs of foul play, no suspicious circumstances, just the devastating collapse of a body that had endured more punishment than most men could imagine. But for those who knew him, those who had seen the cracks forming in the years leading up to this day, Hogan's passing wasn't a sudden shock. It was the culmination of years of wear, denial, and a culture of silence around his declining health. In the weeks and months before his death, Hogan himself had admitted, in rare moments of candor, just how much pain he was living with. In one interview, When asked about the level of discomfort he faced each day, Hogan admitted he was always in pain, but that he had learned to accept it as a constant companion. His mornings began not with exercise or protein shakes, but with 2 cups of coffee and 2 Tylenols just to get moving. To him, the idea of living without pain seemed almost impossible. In fact, when pressed by a therapist on whether he'd rather live pain-free or walk with the confidence of a champion again, Hogan chose the latter. That mentality defined his entire career. Sacrifice health for image, sacrifice longevity for legacy, and in the end, it was that mentality that helped drive his body toward the brink. In May of 2025, just 2 months before his death, Hogan underwent one of the most serious medical procedures of his life: a 4-level anterior cervical discectomy and fusion, a major spinal fusion surgery designed to stabilize his damaged neck and back. This was not new for Hogan. By this point, he had endured over 25 surgeries in the last decade alone, including multiple knee and hip replacements and at least 10 surgeries on his back. Each one was another desperate attempt to hold together the body that had once captivated the world. His representatives at the time painted the surgery as a success, assuring fans there was no reason to panic. But whispers within wrestling circles told a very different story. Florida radio host Bubba the Love Sponge, once Hogan's close friend, went on air claiming Hogan had spent weeks in intensive care, unable to speak, and confined to a hospital bed. These claims painted a terrifying picture of a man already on his deathbed. Hogan's wife, Sky Daly, fought back, posting online that Hogan's heart was strong, that he was not in a coma, and that his recovery was going well. Even Jimmy Hart, Hogan's longtime friend and former manager, tweeted just 2 days before the tragedy that Hogan was doing phenomenal after spending time with his son Nick. But those reassurances were shattered on July 24th. The conflicting accounts only added to the tragedy. Was Hogan really recovering, or was his condition far worse than fans were led to believe? The truth may never be fully known, but sources close to the family admitted later that Hogan's heart had been weak, his breathing labored, and his weight noticeably reduced in those final weeks. The spinal fusion surgery likely placed immense stress on his already fragile cardiovascular system. Decades of physical abuse, compounded by steroid use he had admitted to during the 1994 McMahon trial, left his body a shell of the man who once stood atop the wrestling world. For those who loved him, the end was sudden, yet inevitable. The Hulk Hogan, who inspired millions, was already slipping away long before July 2025. His body could no longer match the myth, and when the final bell rang, he had no more strength to give. But the story didn't end there. What followed was an outpouring of grief, remembrance, and reflection on the complicated legacy of a man who had been both hero and villain, icon and controversy, champion and human being. In the immediate aftermath of Hogan's passing, the stories surrounding his decline began to clash in the public eye. Bubba the Love Sponge was quick to claim vindication, saying he had been warning people for weeks that Hogan was in severe decline and that nobody wanted to hear it. His words carried both frustration and sorrow. Because to be right in this case meant only one thing: that his closest friend was dead. On the other hand, Hogan's family, his wife Sky Daly, and longtime allies like Jimmy Hart insisted that Hogan's final weeks were not the grim nightmare Bubba had described. They said his heart was strong, that there was no coma, no brain damage, and that he had been fighting hard to recover. This tug-of-war over truth versus denial reflected the larger struggle that surrounded Hogan's entire life. The myth of Hulk Hogan versus the reality of Terry Bollea. In his last phone call with Hogan's assistant, Jimmy Hart had told her to pass along one simple message: "Tell Hogan I love him." Those words would tragically become the last he ever sent to his friend of 40 years. Hart later admitted he was stunned when he got the call just hours later that Hogan was gone. The image of him being fine, of him singing karaoke, of him laughing with friends just days before, clashed violently with the harsh reality of a man whose body was quietly breaking down. Fans were left to wonder, had they been misled? Or had the people closest to Hogan simply been clinging to denial until the very end? What is undeniable is that Hogan's health had been deteriorating for years. The man who admitted to steroid use for more than a decade, who endured over 24 surgeries, who wrestled hundreds of matches while hiding crippling injuries, was living in a body that had been pushed past its limits. Doctors have long warned about the cardiovascular toll of steroids, about the risks of repeated surgeries on elderly patients, and about the dangers of major spinal operations in men over 70. Hogan had checked all of those boxes. His heart was weak, his breathing shallow, his energy gone. And while his inner circle fought to keep up the illusion of strength, his body was waving every red flag imaginable. The tragedy is not only that Hogan died, but that perhaps his death could have been delayed. Cardiac distress has warning signs: fatigue, shortness of breath, dramatic weight loss, all of which he displayed in his final weeks. If those signs had been addressed with aggressive intervention, maybe things could have been different. But in the world Hogan lived in, vulnerability was weakness. To admit he was failing would have been to tarnish the immortal image of Hulk Hogan. And so, he smiled through fan appearances, gave interviews where he downplayed his pain, and kept the facade alive until it was too late. When the news of his passing finally broke, the wrestling world erupted in grief. Legends from every era, from Ric Flair to Triple H to The Rock, paid tribute to the man who had defined their industry. Flair revealed that Hogan had once quietly lent him money to keep his son in rehab, refusing repayment because, as he told Flair, "I'm here for you." The Rock told stories of childhood memories, of the match they shared at WrestleMania X8, and of the headband Hogan once gave him as a boy. John Cena, another larger-than-life superstar, openly credited Hogan with paving the way for wrestlers to cross over into mainstream entertainment. Sting, who once faced Hogan as an opponent, called him the greatest of all time. The tributes were not just about wrestling. Hogan had transcended the ring to become a pop culture figure of the 1980s and 1990s. His appearances on MTV, his cartoon series, his merchandise empire, and his ability to turn pro wrestling into a global mainstream attraction cemented him as one of the most influential entertainers of his generation. He headlined 8 of the first 9 WrestleManias, drawing record crowds that still stand as some of the largest in wrestling history. When he turned heel in 1996 and formed the New World Order, he reinvented himself yet again, sparking a revolution in wrestling storytelling that carried WCW to dominance for nearly 2 years. Hulk Hogan was not just a wrestler, he was wrestling. But his legacy, like his life, is complicated. The same man who inspired millions was also caught in scandals that tarnished his name. The leaked racist remarks from a 2007 recording in 2015 led to his temporary removal from the WWE Hall of Fame. His turbulent personal life, divorces, lawsuits, and controversies made him a polarizing figure in his later years. Even his political support for Donald Trump at the 2024 Republican National Convention divided fans who once saw him as a unifying hero. Brooke Hogan, his daughter, remained estranged until his death. citing years of mental and emotional abuse. Their last known exchange, in 2023, was bittersweet. She told him she loved him, but also kept her distance. This duality is what makes Hogan's story so haunting. He was a man who gave so much to the public, who carried himself like a superhero, but who behind closed doors was deeply flawed and painfully human. His final hours, as revealed by the nurse who stood by his side, were not filled with the glory of Hulkamania, but with the fragility of Terry Bollea, a man whose body had been used up, whose heart finally gave out, and whose family and friends could not agree on how much of his suffering to share with the world. Even in death, Hogan's influence is inescapable. Every wrestler who dreams of becoming a global star walks in his shadow. Every promoter who sells merchandise, every fan who chants for their hero, every child who looks at wrestling as something larger than life is experiencing a world that Hogan helped create. His death was not just the end of a man, but the closing of a chapter that defined an entire industry. The silence from Morton Plant Hospital about his exact last words may feel frustrating, but perhaps it is fitting. For a man who lived his entire life in front of the cameras, maybe his final moments were meant to be private, shared only with the medical professionals who fought to keep him alive. Maybe in death, Terry Bollea deserved that dignity. And so, the story ends with a complicated legacy. Hulk Hogan was a hero to millions, a disappointment to others, and a phenomenon that changed professional wrestling forever. His death on that July morning was the last battle in a lifetime of wars, and it was one even he could not win. But his impact will never fade, and his legend will live as long as fans remember the music, the poses, the slams, and the immortal words of Hulkamania. If you grew up with Hulk Hogan, if you ever felt the excitement of Hulkamania running wild, then his story is part of your story too. His triumphs, his flaws, his rise, and his fall are all chapters in the book of wrestling history. And while this may be the end of his personal journey, it is only the beginning of how his story will be remembered. Make sure you stay with us as we continue to uncover the hidden stories behind wrestling's biggest legends. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and join us as we reveal more untold truths from inside and outside the ring. Because while Hulk Hogan's final moments may have ended in silence, the echoes of his legacy will be heard forever.